who have come to settle here, the locals look at us with 1,000 eyes. Now, those are not my words. Those are the words of Mtima, a character in the novel that I'm about to discuss, who has moved to UK, and she's saying that the people in UK are looking at her with 1,000 eyes. That statement has a lot to do with globalization and migration. And in the morning, Professor Wole Soyinka did articulate some very important points about this movement, a movement of people. But of course, globalization entails movement of ideas and technology and etc. Why do Africans like Mtima move? Well, for this, we may have to turn to an African philosopher based in the US. His name is Olufemi Taiwo, who says that people move to some place else because of a very human, very natural, very normal desire for better life. In other words, people move, like Mtima does, because they feel their desire is unfulfilled or unfulfillable in their native country. So they move elsewhere. It's a very natural thing to do. What Taiwo doesn't say, however, is that when you immigrate to another country, the locals look at you with 1,000 eyes. Said Muhammad, the novelist whose work is a focus of our attention here, does say through that character that they look at you with 1,000 eyes. In his book, Dunia Yao, which means in Swahili, their world. I do not want to go into the politics and poetics of why Syed Ahmed Muhammad, a prolific writer, writing in Swahili and has about 60 titles to his name, remains largely unknown and unnamed beyond the Swahili phone world. That is something for another day. But I'll briefly say something about this particular novel. Dunia Yao. It is a story of Ndi, not Mtima. It is a story of Ndi. Ndi is a morally upright and incorrigible civil servant who is edged out of society, out of work, and out of his mind by a system that is inherently corrupt and is driven by self-interest. As a primary narrator of his own tragic fall from a position of influence at work and at home to the abyss of neglect, we encounter a character who is in a permanent mental stupor. So Ndi comes across as an unreliable and incoherent narrator who is always flowing between sanity and insanity. And yet, when we read his account, we are able to glean sufficient information about his disintegrating world. What is also interesting about this particular novel is that it dictates how it should be read. Ndi narrates his story to his daughter. And then the occasional omniscient narrator intervenes and says, na hadithi ya Ndi sasa si hadithi yake mwenyewe tu, bali ni hadithi ya jirani, na pia wananchi wenzake, kwa kweli ni hadithi ya nchi yake. And this story is not just his story alone, but the story of his neighbor and also his fellow countrymen. Indeed, it is the story of his country. What are we reminded of in this instance? It is Frederick Jameson's postulate on the allegory of the nation, in which he says that the third world text is necessarily the story of the nation, not the story of the individual mentioned in that particular story. This is also the story of the nation. Shall we say the story of the nation state, which was a preoccupation for the late Rauf, as we have heard from the previous presentations. So in other words, the story of Ndi is also the story of his nation. But this world spectacularly falls apart. In other words, there are forces that are causing this disintegration of a family, of a man, and indeed of a nation, an African nation. I am arguing in my paper that the novelist not only narrates or narrativizes the teeming disarray in Africa, he's actually theorizing. And he theorizes on any number of issues that have a lot to do with globalization, including what globalization does to individuals and communities, collectivities in a nation as far as technology is concerned, as far as movement is concerned, as far as Americanization, or if you like, McDonaldization is concerned. He talks about all these things almost like Jameson does, but in a more creative manner. But before the chair looks at me with 1,000 eyes, I think I'll just pick on one of those things. Let me talk about movement. Movement, migration. And so I return to Mtima. Mtima is Ndi's daughter, who has moved to, as I said earlier, to the UK. And she writes an email to her father. By the way, she is the only one with whom he communicates. He is in his house with the rest of the family. Nobody talks to him. But thanks to globalization, thanks to technology, he's able to communicate with this one daughter in the UK, and she writes this email. Na akina sisi tulokuja kulowea huku, kila wakati tunatazamwa na wenyeji kwa macho elfu. Kaja kunogea raha zetu huku. Kaja na njaa yake huyu. Kaja kuchafua mazingira yetu huyu. Kaja kutuletea maradhi na tabu. Kaja kuchukua nafasi zetu za kazi. Kaja. For those of us who came to settle here, the locals look at us every day with 1,000 eyes. They have come to get crushed into our pleasure, these ones. They have come with their hunger, these ones. They have come to pollute our environment. They have brought us disease and distress. They have come to take up our jobs. They have come. Mtima's voice, in her narration of a hostile London, far removed as it is from the magnificent London of Versailles' novel, The Gunny-Sack, which she reads, seamlessly changes into mimicry of the xenophobic underpinnings of the English populace, with everyone looking at her with 1,000 eyes. Well, this experience is reminiscent of the reports of rejection in some form or other of African immigrants, those who have moved out of Africa because their desire for a better life remains unfulfilled and unfulfillable back home. But wherever they go, they experience what we know has been the experience of one Yaya Toure, for example, or Samuel Eto'o, or Aubameyang, or Raheem Sterling, the footballers who have, banana peels thrown at them. So ask them if you are in doubt that the reception there is good. Mtima's inhibiting experience in England's icy weather and the icy reception from the English peoples is juxtaposed with a reckless abandon of the tourists in her native island nation, where let loose to maraud anywhere and to act as they please. The limitless freedom of the sex tourists back home is a stark contrast to the suffocating tag of the unwanted and unwelcome African immigrant in Europe, and this has been well articulated by Shoyinga in his presentation earlier on. In other words, the paradox is Mtima's quest for a better life remains in England unfulfilled and unfulfillable. Why? Because of the imbalances between the Africans who are moved by forces of globalization to relocate to the global north and the Europeans who freely move to the global south to fulfill a whole range of human and, if you like, animalistic desires. What accounts for this imbalance? The thrust of Muhammad's novel is that the disparity between the global north and the global south is bound up with the hegemony of Western powers. And now you can be sure that the chair is looking at me with 1,000 eyes. The 2,000 words. The forces of globalization, the novel seems to suggest, emanate from and are controlled by the Western imperium. That position is brought into sharp relief when Dee tells a mythical character named B. Mize, na chanzo cha hali hii chatoka kwingineko. The source of all this is from elsewhere. As far as this nation or nation state is concerned, therefore, African problems have their sources elsewhere. And in this, I argue that we meet Said Ahmed's weakest link in his theory, because he ignores Africa's own complicity in its own suffering, including how Africans, in fact, sold their own in times of slavery. I really appreciate the honor and privilege of being on this panel in memory of our departed friend. And to Kate and to the family, all I can say is that we may not quite perhaps feel the pain in your heart, but we share in your loss and sorrow. Thank you very much.